Thank you, Chairman Bingman, Ranking Member Murkowski, and members of the committee. I am Alaska State Representative Sharice Millett and a lifelong Alaskan. Thank you for the opportunity to communicate a message from the citizens of Alaska over their frustration on the 70-year-old problem and advocate for a solution. With this committee's help, I believe we can get the federal government to clean up its mess and be good stewards of our land as our mission states. During the 2012 Alaska legislative session, I sponsored House Joint Resolution 29. It has been submitted to the chair for this hearing, and I ask that it be submitted for the record.
We'll be glad to include that in our record.
Thank you. This resolution urges the Bureau of Land Management, the BLM, to plug legacy wells properly and to reclaim the legacy well sites as soon as possible in order to protect the environment in the Arctic. It passed the House unanimously. In fact, every member of the Alaska House of Representatives signed on as a co-sponsor. From 1944 to 1982, the United States Navy and the United States Geological Survey drilled 136 wells in or near the National Petroleum Reserve Alaska, NPRA. NPRA is part of the Northern Arctic Coastal Plain that includes Prudhoe Bay, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, ANWR, and stretches all the way to northern Canada. These areas are similar in biology, geography, and oil and gas potential. The NPRA was a testbed not just for oil and gas exploration practices in the Arctic, but also presented a significant opportunity to test Arctic engineering practices. Nearly every site has a variation on the surface and the subsurface as different technologies were tried. The BLM is now the custodian responsible for the surface and subsurface property, including the custody of the abandoned wells, now referred to as legacy wells. Only 16 of the 136 wells have been properly plugged and abandoned. Of those 16, 7 were plugged not by the BLM, but by the North Slope Borough. The remaining 120 wells are in various conditions of flagrant noncompliance. The drill sites, many of which have rusting barrels filled with contaminants and may still be, we just don't know. 2 of the 120 wells are currently, and may have been for up to 30 years, leaking hydrocarbon gas into the atmosphere. 3 other wells can no longer be found. Of those 3 missing wells, 1 well is under a landslide at the edge of the Colville River, the same river that a bridge permit for a private operator was delayed for over 5 years due to environmental concerns. 2 others are at the bottom of lakes where remediation will be very difficult and very expensive. As you can see by the shockingly graphic pictures presented today, we should agree remediation is long overdue. Allowing these unsafe and unsightly wells to litter Alaska's wilderness while threatening wildlife, human safety, and damaging the pristine Arctic environment is unacceptable. These legacy wells have been an issue for over 60 years. Many administrations have failed Alaskans, responsible operators, and by extension, all Americans. However, the current federal government has the opportunity now to take action and solve this problem. Let's stop the out of sight, out of mind mentality. The federal government has received approximately $9.4 billion from lease sales in the NPRA and the Outer Continental Shelf of Alaska. Of that $9.4 billion, there has not been 1 penny used to plug the abandoned or reclaim the legacy wells. The state of Alaska cannot impose fines on the federal government like we would on our private operators, but if we could, the fines would exceed $8 billion. If the statute of limitations were removed, $40 billion. While the federal government rightfully demands proper environmental stewardship on development in Alaska and often uses administrative powers to delay, stop our responsible developers in the name of environmental protection, it turns a blind eye to its own environmental disaster. This hypocrisy outrages Alaskans and should outrage all Americans. It adds insult to injury. Alaskans take pride in how we hold developers to the highest environmental standards in the world. Yet the federal government responsible for protecting America's land is the worst offender in Alaska. Currently, the federal government is rewriting the management plan for the National Petroleum Reserve. It just finished with the public comment portion. Amazingly enough, environmental NGOs submitted over 1,000 pages of comments stating they supported the most restrictive plan that would provide the most protection to the environment of the NPRA. So it's ironic that not one of those NGOs has felt any similar urgency to come to the aid of the legacy wells and the damage already inflicted by the federal government. This goes to the fundamental question of why land should be removed from potential exploration when the true test is one of management. On this level, both the federal government and the environmental groups have misplaced our priorities. The Alaska BLM receives about $1 million a year toward this cleanup effort. The last 3 wells they remediated cost $2 million each. At that pace, my 2-year-old grandson would only see half of these well sites cleaned up in his lifetime. The rest would pollute into the next century. Now for solutions. The administration is planning more offshore Alaska and NPRA lease sales. Let's use a portion of those revenues and plug the abandoned wells and clean up the Arctic tundra. Another option is to lease the well sites to private operators to clean up as a lease requirement those well sites. And last, convey the lands back to Alaska. We'll take responsibility. We'll clean up those lands. Let's help keep Alaska clean. Thank you for your consideration and time, and I'm available for questions.